My son moved back in on a Tuesday in March, and by the following Sunday, his girlfriend had rearranged my living room furniture without asking me a single word about it. I was standing in the doorway with a bag of groceries in each hand, and I just stopped. Because the armchair my wife Dorothy had reupholstered herself, the one she'd spent 3 weekends on with a staple gun and a bolt of blue fabric she'd driven 2 hours to find, was gone from the window where it had lived for 22 years. Pushed back against the wall like it was in the way. Like it was nothing. Kristen looked up from her phone and said, "We opened the room up a little. It was so cramped in here." She smiled when she said it. Not mean, just easy, the way you smile when you've done something helpful. I set the groceries down on the kitchen counter and I looked at that chair against the wall, and I thought about Dorothy's hands on the fabric, the way she'd called me in to help her pull one stubborn corner tight, the way she'd stood back and looked at it when it was done like she'd built something that mattered. And I didn't say a word. My name is Harold Beach. I'm 67 years old. I spent 38 years as a Finnish carpenter in western North Carolina, mostly around Asheville, doing custom cabinetry, built-ins, crown molding, the kind of detailed work that takes time and a steady hand and a real understanding of how things fit together. When you do that work long enough, you start to see the world in terms of joints and fits, what holds, what doesn't, what looks fine from a distance, but is going to fail the moment you put any real weight on it. I bought this house in 1987 with Dorothy. We were 31 years old and broke enough that we carried the couch in ourselves and ate takeout on the floor for a month before we could afford a proper table. We raised 2 kids here, my daughter Maura, who lives in Portland now and calls every Sunday, and my son Derek, who is 38 years old, and who called me from a gas station parking lot in February to tell me his apartment lease had ended and his contracting work had dried up over the winter, and could he please come home for a little while. He didn't ask if Kristen could come, he just said we. I understood that meant her. I said yes anyway. Dorothy passed 3 years ago. A stroke, sudden and final, the kind that doesn't give you any warning or any time to prepare. 41 years we were married. She was a school teacher, 3rd grade, for 34 of those years. She kept a jar of sharpened pencils on the kitchen windowsill her whole life, even after she retired, because she said a house with no sharpened pencils was a house that wasn't ready for anything. That jar is still on the windowsill. I haven't moved it. After she passed, the house got quiet in a way I hadn't been prepared for. Not peaceful quiet, the other kind, the kind that has a weight to it. So when Derek called, I said yes, without thinking twice. Because the honest truth is, I was glad to have someone in the rooms again. I was glad for the noise of it. The shoes by the door and the coffee made by someone else and the sound of the television from the other room at night. I won't pretend otherwise. The first few weeks were all right. Derek helped me replace a section of the back deck that had gone soft over the winter. He was good company in the evenings. Kristen kept to herself mostly, and that was fine. Then the small things started. A Finnish carpenter notices things other people don't. That's the nature of the work. You train your eye to catch what's slightly off, what doesn't meet cleanly, what's been patched instead of fixed. So I noticed the small things early. I just didn't say anything about them, because they were small, and because Derek was my son, and because I kept telling myself it wasn't worth the friction. The armchair was the first one. Then my workbench in the garage. I had a system out there I'd built over decades, every tool in a specific place, laid out the way my hands knew how to find them in the dark. One afternoon I went out to get my block plane, and the whole bench had been reorganized. Hooks moved, cans stacked differently, my good chisels in a coffee can instead of the leather roll I kept them in. Derek said he'd cleaned up a little, made more room for his truck tools. I found the chisel roll on a shelf. One of the chisels had a nick in the edge that hadn't been there before. I put it back in the leather roll, and I told myself it was just a chisel. Then, one evening I came downstairs and found that Dorothy's pencil jar, the one on the kitchen windowsill, the one that had been there since before Derek was born, had been moved to make room for a small cactus Kristen had bought. The pencil jar was on the counter by the toaster, just set aside, like clutter. I picked it up and I held it and I put it back on the windowsill, and I moved the cactus to the counter without saying anything to anyone. In the morning, the cactus was back on the windowsill and the pencil jar was by the toaster again. I moved it back a second time. Nobody said anything. Neither did I. The one that should have told me everything happened at dinner, a Sunday, about 6 weeks in. Derek's old friend Marcus came over, a good man I'd known since Derek was in middle school. Marcus hadn't been to the house since Dorothy passed, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked around and said, "Man, Harold, this place brings back some memories. How long have you been in this house now?" And before I could open my mouth, Kristen said, "Derek grew up here. We're staying with his dad while we get back on our feet." She said it pleasantly, genuinely pleasant. She wasn't trying to slight me. She was just telling the story the way it lived in her head. Staying with his dad. Like I was a stop on a road trip, like the house was Derek's childhood bedroom, and I was the parent in the background making sandwiches. Marcus looked at me just for a second with a question in his eyes, and then looked away. And I looked down at the table, and I counted the wood grain lines in the pine the way I used to count cuts on a long rip just to keep my hands steady. I let it all go. That was my pattern. At 67, I kept telling myself that a man picks his battles, that Derek wasn't cruel, that Kristen didn't mean anything by it. And that was all true. But there is a difference, and I only understood it fully later, between picking your battles and just quietly agreeing to disappear. Those are not the same thing. One is wisdom, the other is something else. I want to be fair about Kristen because she was not a bad person. She paid her share of the utilities without being asked. She brought groceries home sometimes. She was kind to the neighbor's dog. But she had moved into a house that was full of 40 years of another woman's presence, and whether she knew it or not, she had started editing that presence out. A pencil jar here, an armchair there. Dorothy's reading glasses, which I'd left on the side table by the couch, because I hadn't been able to make myself move them, disappeared one afternoon, and I found them in a drawer in the spare room wrapped in a paper towel. I held those glasses for a long time. That evening I called my daughter Maura in Portland, and she asked how things were going, and I said fine, because I didn't want to make it into a thing, because I kept telling myself I was probably too sensitive. When someone moves the line an inch at a time, you start to wonder whether the line was ever really where you thought it was. What finally burned the doubt away for good was not dramatic. It didn't announce itself. I was in the garage on a Saturday morning looking for a particular bit, a 1/4-inch spiral upcut I'd had for 15 years, and I couldn't find it. I went through every drawer, every shelf, every coffee can on that reorganized bench. Couldn't find it. I went inside and asked Derek if he'd seen it, described it, and he said he might have borrowed it for a job a few weeks back. I asked if he had it. He checked his truck. He came back and said he thought he might have left it at a job site. A 15-year-old bit I'd used on 100 pieces of furniture was sitting in somebody's job site because my son had borrowed it without asking and then not kept track of it. That sounds like a small thing. I know how it sounds. But here's what a carpenter knows about small things. A joint that's off by a 32nd of an inch doesn't look like much at the rough stage. You can sand it, you can fill it, you can make it look clean. But put that piece of furniture in a real room with real use, and inside a year, the joint is failing. The small things are always telling you the true thing, if you're willing to read them. That night, I didn't sleep well. I lay in my bed in the house I had bought 36 years ago, and I looked at the ceiling and I thought about Dorothy's reading glasses wrapped in a paper towel in a drawer, and my chisels in a coffee can, and the armchair against the wall, and Kristen saying staying with his dad like that was just the nature of things. And I wasn't hurt anymore. I was clear. There is a difference. Hurt keeps you in place. Clear gets you moving. The next morning I got up early, and I called my old partner Ray, who I'd worked with for 20 years before he retired. I told him what I'd been sitting on, and he listened the way Ray always listened, without interrupting, and when I finished, he said, "Harold, how long have you been letting this go on?" I said, "About 3 months." He said, "That's 3 months too long." I told him I didn't want to blow up Derek's situation. Ray was quiet for a second, and then he said, "Son, your situation has already been blown up. You just haven't said so yet." I sat with that for the rest of the morning, and then I did something that surprised me. I called a locksmith, not to change the locks. Not yet. I called him to get an assessment of the exterior doors because 2 of them had locks that were 30 years old and I had been meaning to replace them for 2 years. While he was there, I had him rekey the front and back door. New keys for me. I didn't make copies for Derek and Kristen yet. I told myself I'd decide about that. Then I called Maura. I told her everything. All of it. The chair. The chisels. The pencil jar. The glasses. The bit. The Saturday dinner. Maura was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Dad, why didn't you call me sooner?" I said I didn't want to make trouble. She said, "You're not making trouble. You're living in your own house." She said she was going to fly out in 2 weeks, and I told her she didn't have to do that, and she said she was doing it anyway. I felt something come loose when I hung up, the way a board releases when you finally get the right pressure on a stubborn joint. Something that had been locked up in my chest for 3 months just let go. I want to slow down here because the next part is the part that changed everything, and it didn't happen the way I expected. I expected it to come from a confrontation. I expected raised voices, my son defending Kristen, Kristen explaining herself, the whole thing escalating the way family things do when they finally break open. That is not how it happened. It happened on a Wednesday morning. I was in the garage, and I had taken every tool off that reorganized workbench, and I was putting them back the way they had been for 20 years. My way. The way my hands knew. And Derek came out and stood in the doorway and watched me for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "Dad, you don't have to do that right now." I kept working. I said, "Yeah, I do." He was quiet. Then he said, "Are you mad about the bit because I'm going to replace it?" I set down what I was holding and I turned around and I looked at my son, 38 years old, tired around the eyes, a little thinner than he used to be, and I said, "Derek, sit down." He sat on the step stool. I said, "This workbench has been laid out the same way since you were in grade school. Your grandfather taught me that system. I've worked from it for 30 years. When you reorganized it without asking me, you didn't just move some tools. You told me without saying a word that this space isn't mine to have a system in anymore. And that's been happening all over this house for 3 months, and I have let it happen because I love you and I didn't want to make things harder for you than they already are. But I need you to hear me clearly right now. This is my house. Not ours. Mine. I am glad you are here. I want to help you get back on your feet, but I am not a guest in this house, and I will not be treated like one." Derek didn't say anything for a long time. He was looking at the floor of the garage, at the concrete I'd sealed myself 20 years ago. Then he said, very quietly, "I know, Dad," and something in how he said it made me keep going. So I said, "There's something else." I went inside and I came back with Dorothy's reading glasses and I held them out. These were on the side table where I put them. "I want to know who moved them." He looked at those glasses and his jaw tightened and he said, "I'll talk to Kristen." I said, "I know she didn't mean any harm by it. I know that. But I need you to understand that your mother's things in this house are not decorating choices. They are not clutter. They are not in Kristen's way. And the pencil jar on the kitchen windowsill stays on the kitchen windowsill. If that's a problem, then we have a bigger conversation to have." He looked up then, and his eyes were red in a way I hadn't expected. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't see how bad it had gotten." I said, "I know you didn't. That's what I'm telling you now." What followed was hard. I won't pretend it wasn't. Kristen took the conversation Derek had with her very badly at first. She came to find me that evening, and she was upset, and she said she had never meant to disrespect Dorothy and that she felt like she was being made to feel unwelcome. I listened to all of it, and then I said to her, as evenly as I could, "Kristen, I want you here. You are welcome here. But welcome doesn't mean you get to edit out the woman who lived in this house for 40 years. Those two things can exist at the same time, you being here and Dorothy's memory being here. I need both." She was quiet for a moment. And then something in her face shifted. Not a dramatic shift, a small one. The kind that means something actually landed. She said, "You're right. I'm sorry. I didn't think of it that way." And I believed her. I still believe her. I don't think she's a bad person. I think she moved into a house full of grief. She didn't know how to be around, and she started managing it the only way she knew how, which was to tidy it away. That's not malice. It's just a person who hasn't lost anybody yet doing what people do when they don't understand loss. Maura flew in on a Friday, and the first thing she did when she walked through the door was look at the kitchen windowsill, and she said, "Good, the pencil jar's back." I told her what had happened, and she sat at the kitchen table and listened, and then she said, "Dad, you know what the hardest part of this whole thing is?" I said I didn't know. She said, "It's that you would have done anything for Derek. He could have just asked you, straight out. Come to you and said, 'Dad, we need help, we need space, we need to figure this out together.' And you would have given him whatever you had. He didn't have to take anything." And there it was again. That truth. The one that sat heaviest. That the whole thing had never needed to happen the way it happened. Because I had never been a man who would have said no to his son. Fear made him take what he could have simply asked for. Over the next few weeks, things settled. Not perfectly, and not all at once, but steadily. Derek found a small kitchen remodel job through Marcus and then another one through word of mouth, and by late spring his work had picked back up to something manageable. The conversation about them finding their own place came naturally from Derek himself. He said they'd been looking at a rental about 20 minutes away. He said, "I think it's time, Dad." I said I thought he was right. There were no hard words about it, just the truth, and both of us ready to say it. They moved out on a Saturday in June. I helped them load the truck. At the end of it, before Derek got in the cab, he stood in the driveway and he looked at the house, the front porch I'd rebuilt from scratch in 2004, the flower beds Dorothy had planted along the walkway that I'd kept up as best I could for 3 years, and he said, "I'm sorry I let things go the way they did." I told him he didn't have to keep saying that. He said, "I know. I just want to make sure you hear it." I told him I heard it. I watched them drive away, and I stood in that driveway for a few minutes alone. And then I went inside. The house was quiet again, that same weighted quiet from before. I won't lie to you and say it felt like victory, because it didn't. It felt like an empty house feels when you've just watched the last car pull away. I stood in the kitchen, and I looked at the pencil jar on the windowsill, and I thought about Dorothy, and I thought about Derek, and I thought about Kristen and the cactus, and the drawer where the reading glasses had been folded up in a paper towel like they were nothing. I put Dorothy's reading glasses back on the side table. That's where they belong. That's where they're going to stay. Ray came over that Sunday, and we sat out on the back deck on the section Derek and I had rebuilt together in March, which was straight and true and will outlast both of us. And Ray asked me how I was really doing. I said I was all right. He said, "You sure?" I said, "I'm working on it. Because here is what I know now, that I did not know well enough before. And I spent 38 years building things for a living, so I ought to have understood this long ago. You can't skip the joint. That's the temptation in finished carpentry when you're tired and you're behind and the piece looks fine. You want to move past the part that needs the most attention and just sand over it and coat it and hope it holds. It never holds. The joint has to be cut right. It has to fit true. It has to be what it is before you can build anything solid on top of it. The same is true with people you love, with the rooms you live in, with the things that belong to the ones you've lost. You cannot let someone sand over them and coat them and hope it holds. It doesn't hold, not over any real stretch of time. The line has to be set, and it has to be what it is, and you have to be willing to stand at it, even when the person on the other side of it is someone you would do anything for. Derek calls on Sundays now, most Sundays. Sometimes he comes over and we sit on that deck and drink coffee and talk about the work he has coming up and occasionally about how things are going with Kristen, who I think is trying in her own way. He brought her to dinner last month and she brought flowers, and she stood in the kitchen and looked at the pencil jar on the windowsill and she said, simply, "That's a good thing to keep." I said, "Yes, it is. Small thing. It meant something anyway." Here is what all of this taught me, and I'll tell it to you plain. A house is not just a deed and a mortgage and 4 walls. It is every choice you made inside it. It is every person who moved through it and left something of themselves in the rooms. It is the armchair by the window and the pencil jar on the sill and the reading glasses on the table and the floor you finished yourself on a Saturday 30 years ago when you didn't have money to hire it out. And the moment you stop standing for all of that, the moment you start letting it get moved to a wall, folded in a drawer, reorganized out of your own hands, you are not keeping the peace. You are just losing ground 1 foot at a time, and one morning you will wake up in your own paid-off house and wonder how you became a stranger in it. Don't let it get that far. Say the plain true thing while you can still say it kindly. Because the kindest version is always the first one. Before you go, I'd really like to know how you see this one. Comment 1 if you think I was right to have the direct conversation with Derek when I did, before things got any worse. Comment 2 if you think I waited too long and should have spoken up the first time Kristen moved that chair. Or comment 3 if you think I should have just let it go entirely and kept the peace for Derek's sake. There's no wrong answer there. Every one of those choices has something true in it. And tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. Because it genuinely moves me how far these stories travel and how many of you already know exactly what I'm talking about. If any part of this reached you, if you've ever stood in your own house and felt like a guest in it, then you know you're not alone in that. And if this was worth your time tonight, the kindest thing you can do is subscribe and stay. because there's a whole life's worth of these still to go. From a carpenter in North Carolina with a pencil jar on the windowsill and a 30-year-old armchair back where it belongs. Thank you for being here. Truly. Setting boundaries with the people we love most is never easy, but Harold's story reminds us that speaking up honestly and early is itself an act of love. When we let small things slide to keep the peace, we don't protect the relationship, we slowly hollow it out. Say the true thing kindly, while kindness is still easy. The joint has to be cut right before anything solid can be built on top of it. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of meaningful entertainment while sharing a life lesson worth carrying with you.